The NEA, more than any other institution in America, we have been stalwarts in the protection of public education and the children and students that we serve. Public education is the cornerstone, the foundation, the core of democracy. It's what has made this country great.
I am not astonished that the NEA is concerned about apartheid. We have learned to expect from NEA involvement in social issues wherever there is a question of justice.
And I know that teachers in this room are making a difference every single day. And I know that the National Education Association is making a huge difference in this country.
We are powerful because our cause is powerful, because we have accepted the responsibility of tipping the scales in favor of the next generation and the future of America.
The National Education Association and the American Teachers Association, two organizations forged from troubled and turbulent times in our nation's history. The merger of the ATA and the NEA paved the way to make the National Education Association the inclusive organization it is today. Strong in the face of resolute and unrelenting opposition. Courageous, defending the rights of all students and all education employees. And most importantly, united into a chorus 3.2 million strong. A progressive organization dedicated to the pursuit of human rights and social justice. Together, the ATA and the NEA have forged a legacy of inclusion. (1857). James Buchanan was the newly elected president. The issue of slavery and threat of civil war dominated the nation. Teachers worked in one-room schoolhouses earning less than $100 a year. Learning to read and write was a luxury for most children, and teaching a child of color was a crime.
In 1857, there were just about 4 million enslaved Africans from Delaware over to, say, what is now called Galveston, Texas, and the Deep South. Education at that time was marginal in the North and basically underground in the slave states because there were penalties for people teaching African Americans, especially if they were enslaved individuals.
For the children of immigrants from Europe, however, education was the key to opportunity. As their numbers grew, there was an outcry for free primary and secondary education for all children and for qualified teachers. In response, 10 state education associations sent out the call, an invitation to the nation's educators to unite. And in August of 1857, they gathered in Philadelphia to form the National Teachers Association. In 1870, the name would be changed to the National Education Association. Across the country, black teachers endured untold hardships and earned only half of what white teachers earned.
The National Education Association accepted black members, but they were not integrated into the fabric of the National Education Association.
In 1857, with the Dred Scott decision, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed that slaves were not U.S. citizens, but property of their owners.
In 1857, we had a watershed judicial decision known as the Dred Scott case, which attempted to resolve all questions about the status of black folks in the country, including their rights. And in that decision was announced the infamous line that African Americans had no rights anybody else were legally compelled to respect.
The long road to recognizing the rights of black Americans began in the spring of 1865. After 4 long years and over 500,000 lives lost, the Civil War finally came to an end. The hard work of Reconstruction had begun, for the nation and for its educators. At their convention that summer, NEA President J.P. Wickersham denounced slavery and recommended that no seceded states be readmitted to the Union until they had agreed to provide a free public school system for Black as well as white children.
Even after the Civil War and after the Emancipation Proclamation, I think NEA continued to demonstrate that issues of Black people were extremely important in public education and in the discourse of public education issues in American society. NEA was far ahead of most organizations in this country, recognizing educational issues affecting Black people.
In the post-Reconstruction era, segregation permeated life in the North and South. Black lynching in the South was commonplace and without reprisal. In 1896, the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld legal segregation of schools.
Plessy versus Ferguson was a judicial decision of the Supreme Court in 1896. And it summed up and gave constitutional support to a theory of separate, racially speaking, but equal in terms of service and facilities. That decision rippled throughout the education system, especially in the South. And of course, the Deep South states went in the direction of separate and unequal.
The Plessy versus Ferguson decision forced Black teachers into a desperate struggle to provide quality education for Black students.
We had inferior schools, we had inferior equipment, we had unequal funding, and we certainly had unequal salaries. And yet we were expected to do, and we did do, in many instances, an outstanding job.
Black teachers rose to the occasion of functioning in an environment without adequate resources, without adequate facilities, without adequate instructional materials. They rose to that occasion, and many of those teachers were exceptionally qualified.
Struggling against incredible odds, Black educators developed an impressive network of educational institutions. In 1856, Wilberforce University was founded in Ohio and served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Howard University was founded to provide education for newly emancipated slaves. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute and spoke at the NEA convention in St. Louis. Spelman College for Black Women was founded in Atlanta. W.E.B. Du Bois helped found the NAACP and served as a professor at several major universities. Mary McLeod Bethune founded Bethune-Cookman College. And in 1904, teachers in Black schools nationwide came together to form the National Association of Colored Teachers. It was renamed the American Teachers Association in 1937.
American Teachers Association was founded as the National Association of Teachers of Negro Youth. There was a founding meeting in Nashville, Tennessee in 1904. 3 years later, in 1907, the organization merged with the land-grant colleges group to form the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools. It went by that name, the NATCS, until 1937, when they changed the name to the American Teachers Association.
Led by J.R.E. Lee, a prominent Black educator, this association offered teachers in Black schools a national forum.
The American Teachers Association was the place for Black educators to mobilize educationally and politically to address educational concerns of Black children, Black teachers, and principals.
It was a very important role to have state and national organizations representing the interests of African American teachers.
The American Teachers Association was a voice for Black educators when Black educators had no voice.
The historical importance of ATA was working for equality of education.
It was the only alternative the African American teachers had to a national coalition to vent concerns, to share experiences, to improve our in-service training, and to look out for the fringe benefits for African American teachers throughout the country.
Even during this period of rigid discrimination and separatism, the ATA was fully integrated. Its early ranks included a sizable number of white teachers who instructed black students. The Supreme Court doctrine of separate but equal had sentenced black students to unequal funding and opportunities.
I never rode on a bus. I walked 3.5 miles when I was 8. And the white family that lived adjacent to our farm, son, rode the buses.
Most schools and state education associations were segregated. Black students were blocked from acceptance to many colleges and universities because the schools they attended were not accredited.
Well, in those days was way before the laws were passed to integrate the schools. So everything was separate, but absolutely not equal. Blacks were in one-room schools, and the resource materials, textbooks and all were left over from the whites. Schools were not accredited. Teachers didn't have tenure. It was just a rough time.
This dire situation was one of many facing black students and teachers. To address these issues, the NEA and the ATA formed their first joint committee.
One of the reasons to get together was to work around these issues of high school and collegiate accreditation, to make sure that African American students who were going to high school were going to accredited high schools. Joint committee was formed, and they worked effectively over the next 4 to 5 years to gain accreditation for black high schools and black colleges.
The NEA-ATA Joint Committee had an immediate national impact. With the leadership of ATA Executive Director H. Council Trenholm, the Joint Committee helped gain accreditation for black schools, encouraged the U.S. Office of Education to study the schooling of black students, promoted fair treatments of blacks in textbooks, and joined the U.S. Health Service in collecting data on the status of black health.
NEA, as it grew, it recognized that blacks were not treated fairly in this country. The Joint Committee was a way to get it done so white educators could hear it from black educators as to what was happening on the front line.
And the NEA realized that they needed to start to work more diligently with African American educators, that this would be an opportunity for both parties to work together to improve conditions for African American students and teachers.
Without question, the most important event to impact public education was the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education, ordering the desegregation of public schools.
Brown versus Board of Education. You could comfortably say that it caught the nation off guard. You could certainly say that it caught the NEA off guard. It was the most monumental Supreme Court decision of the 20th century. Every aspect of American life and culture had to be re-examined in the context of Brown.
The American Teachers Association was a major contributor to the Brown versus Board of Education Legal Defense Fund.
I think at that time, Brown was the singular agenda of the black community. ATA, its membership was linked to civil rights, human rights organizations, the NAACP, and it was through those linkages, this gathering of professional and civil rights activists and progressive thinkers pushed Brown to occur.
The decision in Brown was something that blacks all wanted, and nobody knew what the outcome was going to be, but one thing it was very clear, that racism was no longer sanctioned legally in this country.
Sadly, the NEA did not support the legal challenge to segregation in the Supreme Court and maintained segregated state affiliates throughout the South.
Although the NEA had worked with black teachers and had shown some initiative in doing so, and to its credit, the NEA, in the immediate aftermath of the Brown decision, clearly did not do as much as it could. The NEA did not publicly support the Brown decision until 1961.
The Brown versus Board of Education victory proved to be a double-edged sword. School districts in 17 states used court-ordered desegregation as an excuse to dismiss hundreds of black teachers.
In the wake of Brown versus Board, one of the underappreciated outcomes in terms of understanding is the tremendous number of African American teachers who lost their jobs or who were demoted or who were transferred to situations that were marginal to what they had built their careers on.
Between 1954 and 1963, a study was conducted by Samuel Etheridge. Sam Etheridge happens to be the first black professional staffer hired by NEA. He finds out that as a result of desegregation, 30-some thousand black teachers in the American South and border states lost their jobs.
I say that Jim Crow had a pink slip, and it was issued to black principals and teachers post-Brown. It was the American Teachers Association that really was instrumental in making Brown a reality. And again, because of its linkages with civil rights organizations, primarily the NAACP, they were able to mobilize an agenda across organizations and keep that agenda in the forefront.
The NEA joined the ATA's fight to support black teachers facing discrimination and established a $1 million fund to protect and promote the professional, civil, and human rights of educators. There were events happening in the 50s and 60s that would forever change the face of America. This iconic period in our nation's history ushered in the modern civil rights movement. The movement began when African American veterans came home from World War II to find they were denied the rights they had risked their lives to protect. The struggle for civil rights encompassed events both tragic and inspiring. The assassination of ATA leader Harry T. Moore on Christmas Eve of 1951. The brutal murder of Emmett Till in the summer of 1955. Rosa Parks' courageous refusal to give up her seat on a bus in Alabama, and the Montgomery bus boycotts that followed. The integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, only after federal troops were sent in to help. The 4 black students that sparked the sit-in movement at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. James Meredith, who became the first black student at the University of Mississippi, again requiring federal troops. Governor George Wallace's famous stand in the schoolhouse door to oppose integration at the University of Alabama. The bombing of a Birmingham church and the tragic death of 4 little girls. Freedom Summer, when white university students came south to participate in voter registration drives. Also during this period, the NEA and the ATA worked vigorously to support black teachers who were fired for participating in the voter registration drives that were so central to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s.
So NEA was actively involved in many ways at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, when the issue came up whether blacks should be given the right to vote.
I went down to register in Greene County. And there was a fellow who asked me to read the preamble to the Constitution of the United States who couldn't read himself. And I'm a principal of school. And I thought that was an insult. It was an insult to me, it was an insult to the Board of Education to have this principal come down to ask him to read the preamble of the Constitution. And, you know, if I couldn't read, I had no business being principal of school. I never shall forget that.
The teachers who were members of the ATA's black affiliate in Selma, Alabama, decided that they wanted to have a campaign. Teachers wanted to register to vote. Fit to teach, fit to vote.
As a citizen, a teacher has the right to vote, whether you're black or whether you're white, whether you're a Democrat or Republican in areas where one or the other party seems to rule. A teacher does not have to stop being a citizen.
The voter registration drives of the civil rights era were really community education projects that required the input of school teachers who knew the communities, who knew what families to call to get folks to come to register. These school teachers became the leaders of voter registration programs.
The Teachers Campaign provided a spark for the voter drives and the famous 5-day Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
The NEA's, I think, role in the civil rights in the South was significant. It was the teachers in Selma that actually started the voter registration drives, which led to the Selma to Montgomery March.
There's a wonderful moment in the Selma movement in 1965 when black teachers marching en masse to the place of registration and sending a signal to the community that if we do it, it's something desirable and something you've got to do. If we're willing to risk, you can risk too.
In August of 1963, over 250,000 people, including thousands of teachers and public school employees, marched on Washington and heard the inspiring words of Dr. King.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
In the midst of the civil rights struggle, an unbelieving nation witnessed a string of assassinations. Medgar Evers, President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, Malcolm X, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was murdered a few short years after winning the Nobel Prize for Peace. In 1964, the hard work and sacrifices of the many committed to civil rights paid off when former teacher and President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, signed the landmark Civil Rights Act.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
24 hours after the Civil Rights Act is passed in 1964, the NEA passes its Resolution 12 to promote the integration of the black and white state teachers associations.
You know, a lot of people don't realize that while Martin Luther King was leading a civil rights march throughout the South, we simultaneously were fighting a struggle to desegregate the schools in the South and in other parts of the country. The National Education Association gave birth to its involvement in teaching human rights as a result of these efforts.
This period of tremendous social change set the stage for the groundbreaking merger that forever changed the face and course of the National Education Association. The Joint Committee first discussed a plan to unify the NEA and the ATA in 1945. And from that time, both worked together to fight inequities in the treatment of black school children and their teachers.
When the NEA did step up to the plate, they did so in very positive ways. In 1964, they passed a resolution demanding that all states unify their black and white state teachers associations.
And in the new organization, there was a hope by many of us that it would not be a continuation of what already existed, but that a new organization would emerge with new goals, new aspirations, new hopes, new desires, and a new faith.
In 1964, the NEA Representative Assembly passed a resolution requiring racially segregated affiliates to merge. And in early June 1966, ATA delegates voted 178-3 to merge with the NEA. Several weeks later, on June 28th, a unanimous NEA Representative Assembly seconded the motion to merge.
I really felt good about the fact that we were together because we didn't have a voice at the state. But once the merger came about, then we were included in everything that happened. So it was not that the black teachers got this and the white teachers got this. But when the merger came about, then everybody was working together.
The feeling in that room on the date that the merger was signed was one of both relief and joy. It had been a long struggle, and many of us were very tired of trying to reach agreement. And yet, we were very proud of the end product and thought that it was worth it.
I think it gave us a sense of real accomplishment to have been a small part of one of the most dramatic changes in the history of American education.
We were all excited about it, and the way it worked out, the convention itself, it was a very emotional time for us and a very beautiful occasion with the signing of the agreement.
The dramatic and heartfelt merger ceremony took place in Miami Beach, where 13 years earlier, the NEA had relocated its convention when the city assured them it would not discriminate against black delegates.
We joined the NEA in the merger. The lights in the auditorium went down and focused on a small table on the stage in the convention, assembled, and they, to the tune of Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, His truth is marching on, the merger was finally consummated. I just felt very good, and I really shed a tear because I knew how far we had come, but I realized how far we needed to go.
ATA President R.J. Martin and NEA President Richard Batchelder signed the unification certificate.
In an atmosphere that was highly receptive, our delegates, after much consideration and after weighing the pros and the cons, and believe me, they did, decided that this is indeed the way.
The civil rights movement was an education movement. You were really teaching the community, the nation. And so civil rights was an education movement, and an awful lot of teachers in a lot of places were deeply involved, including the NEA.
How far has the National Education Association come since the merger 40 years ago? The answer can be found in the faces of diversity within NEA. The answer is evident in the civil rights causes in which NEA so readily involves itself. The answer is undeniable, as NEA carries the torch for teachers, education support professionals, and the students they serve. To ensure minority members were well represented among the leadership, NEA started the Minority Leadership Training Program.
I don't believe that I would be where I am today if it had not been for the Minority Leadership Training Program. You cannot beat the training that the NEA provides, and you cannot beat the training that the Minority Leadership Training Program provides. It was a training program second to none.
The merger of the ATA and the NEA has left a powerful legacy, not only for black teachers and students, but for all minority populations.
I really do believe that it was the American Teachers Association that gave NEA its diversity agenda, that shaped it, that influenced it, that was the energy behind it being actualized.
To commemorate the merger, NEA agreed to continue an ATA tradition by holding an annual Human and Civil Rights Awards program.
I think it's important for our members to understand the contributions of people in the area of human and civil rights, and the Human and Civil Rights Awards that recognize outstanding people throughout the nation that have contributed to the civil rights movement.
When you go to that Human and Civil Rights dinner, you see everybody. You see a melting pot there. And that's what America looks like. And that's what it's all about. And that came as a result, a direct result of the merger.
In 1967, only 1 year after the merger, the NEA Representative Assembly established a task force on civil rights and elected Braulio Alonso its first Hispanic president. After 3 years of NEA lobbying efforts, the Bilingual Education Act passed in 1968. NEA also established a Center for Human Relations and elected Elizabeth Duncan Kuntz as its first black president. In 1969, the NEA publicly opposed the nomination of Clement F. Haynesworth for the Supreme Court because of his negative record on civil rights. And that same year, NEA sponsored a national conference on equal education opportunity for Native American children. Throughout the 70s, NEA continued its commitment to inclusion, diversity, equality, and justice. It mounted major task forces in Mississippi and Louisiana to help affiliates cope with problems arising from school desegregation. And it formed caucuses for important minority groups.
Since the 1960s, the NEA has necessarily changed for the better because it is more inclusive. There are simply more voices of a range of people of color. In many ways, the NEA, like democracy itself, is enhanced, it's strengthened.
NEA was a strong supporter of the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and worked tirelessly to strike down mandatory maternity leave for pregnant teachers. It secured passage of Public Law 94-142, which guaranteed education for disabled children. And in 1975, James Harris became NEA's second black president. In the 80s, the NEA voted full membership rights for education support professionals. And after years of lobbying, celebrated the official designation of a Martin Luther King Jr. federal holiday. In 1983, Mary Hatwood Futrell became the NEA's third black president.
When I think about NEA, I think about an organization that really, in my opinion, reflects America. We have stood up for women's rights. We have stood up for Native American rights and Hispanic rights and Asian and African American. It didn't matter what their backgrounds happened to be.
Throughout the 80s, the NEA continued its lobbying efforts, pushing for the Civil Rights Restoration Act to reinforce laws against sex discrimination. It launched a nationwide dropout prevention program. It produced And Justice for All, a series of reports on the status of minorities. And it worked tirelessly to end apartheid in South Africa.
We were very much involved with the efforts to try to do away with apartheid in South Africa. So some people might say, well, what does all that have to do with the NEA? Well, our point was, if we tolerate segregation and apartheid in South Africa, how can we speak out against similar things in America? And especially when you looked at the education system.
From the 90s until today, the NEA continues to build on the legacy of the NEA-ATA merger. It works to keep schools safe and hospitable for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender students and education employees. It strives to solve the educational challenges of our nation's growing minority populations. It stands against anti-Semitism and other religious oppression. It fights for the historically underserved.
NEA has just emerged as a stalwart in leadership in the American society, and whether they recognize it or not, it all started with the merger of the two, ATA and NEA.
I believe NEA has to hold strong to the position that public schools are the only way for America to continue to progress.
I think the future is great for NEA in the area of human and civil rights.
Wherever discrimination exists, the NEA needs to continue to be out on the forefront and speaking against it and doing something about it.
And if NEA stays out there on the cutting edge, out front, then of course, I think the future is bright.
The legacy of the NEA-ATA merger is the NEA today. The NEA that we currently have, viewed across the world as one of the most progressive organizations of its kind, the nation's largest labor union, constantly taking difficult, tough positions.
The NEA commitment to human and civil rights is as strong or stronger today than it has ever been, born out of the merger of the ATA and the NEA. And as the years go by, it will become even stronger. We believe at the NEA that great public schools are a basic right for every child. human and civil rights certainly is a big factor in making sure that that occurs.
The merger and its legacy of inclusion have made the NEA what it is today. A proud, diverse, socially conscious organization, growing stronger every day.